Royal weddings before, about 1850, were not romances. They were business mergers conducted by terrified strangers in front of crowds, foreign delegations, fire-prone wooden architecture, and at least one rival faction carrying knives. The wonder is not that some of them ended in massacre, mass stampede, cannon fire, beheading, syphilis, and a hanged toddler. The wonder is that anyone survived to consummate the marriage at all, the wedding that started a massacre. In August of 1572, Margarite de Valois, the 19-year-old Catholic sister of the King of France, married Henry of Navarre, the 18-year-old leader of the French Protestants. The wedding was the personal project of Marguerite's mother, Catherine de' Medici, who had decided that the way to end a decade of religious civil war was to perform a public Catholic Protestant marriage on the steps of Notre Dame de Paris. Because Henry could not enter a Catholic cathedral, he stood at the door of Notre Dame while a stand-in walked Marguerite up to the altar. Catherine de' Medici sat inside the cathedral and watched. 6 days later, the massacre started. On August 22, an assassin shot Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the highest-ranking Protestant in France, from a window on the Rue des Fosses Saint-Germain. The shot mangled the admiral's hand and arm but failed to kill him. With thousands of Huguenots in Paris for the royal wedding and the king's new Protestant brother-in-law openly expected to demand reprisal, Catherine de' Medici and the royal council met in secret at the Tuileries and authorized the killing of the Protestant leadership preemptively. On the night of August 23 and 24, the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang, and Catholic militias and royal guards began going door to door. Coligny was thrown alive from a window of his lodgings. His body was dragged through Paris by a mob. The killing spread from the Protestant leadership to ordinary Huguenots in the streets, then to a dozen provincial cities over the following weeks. Modern historians put the dead in Paris alone at around 3,000 and the national total at between 5,000 and 10,000, with older estimates going as high as 30,000. It is the worst civilian massacre in early modern French history, and it began 6 days after a royal wedding designed to prevent it. Marguerite herself, in her memoirs, describes a wounded Protestant nobleman named Léron, bursting into her bedroom in the night, with men chasing him, and she hid him behind her bed. Henry of Navarre was forced to convert to Catholicism on September 26 of 1572 to save his life. Then held as a kind of polite prisoner at the French court for almost 4 years. He escaped in 1576 and converted back to Protestantism. He eventually became Henry IV of France, converted a second time, and was assassinated in 1610. Marguerite and Henry's marriage was annulled in 1599 with no children. The wedding designed to unite France produced a corpse-strewn city, a king who was eventually murdered, and one of the great religious traumas in European memory. The fireworks that killed 132 guests. On May 16 of 1770, Marie Antoinette of Austria, age 14, married the Dauphin Louis, the heir to the French throne, age 15, in the chapel at Versailles. He would become Louis XVI. She had been sent across Europe by her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, as a diplomatic asset. He was a chubby, awkward locksmithing teenager who avoided eye contact. Neither of them had any idea what they were doing in the marriage bed, and they would not figure it out for another 7 years. The wedding celebrations climaxed on May 30th in the Place Louis XV in Paris, on what is now the Place de la Concorde. The Ruggieri brothers, the official royal pyrotechnicians, had built a wooden colonnade and temple at the river end of the square for the firing of a vast celebratory display. A rocket misfired and set the wooden structure on fire. The crowd, estimated at 500,000 people, surged toward the Rue Royale, where it ran headlong into oncoming carriages of Parisian nobles. The street was also dug up for new construction, with deep open trenches running across it. People were trampled. People were crushed against carriage wheels. People were pushed into the river. The official death toll, recorded by the Lieutenant General of Police Antoine de Sartine, was 132, with hundreds more injured. It is still the deadliest fireworks disaster in human history. The newlyweds were not at the square. When they heard, they donated their personal monthly allowance to relief of the families. Contemporary accounts also note that thieves moved through the field of bodies during the night, pulling jewelry off corpses before they could be laid out at the cemetery of the Madeleine. The unconsummated marriage hung over them for the next 7 years. The popular story is that Louis had a medical condition called phimosis and needed minor surgery. The popular story is unsupported by his own diary, which records normal hunting throughout the supposed recovery period. Their first child was finally born in December of 1778. They had 4 children. Louis was guillotined on January 21 of 1793. Marie Antoinette was guillotined on October 16 of 1793, in the same square where 132 of their wedding guests had been crushed to death 23 years earlier. The groom passed out in the fireplace. On April 8 of 1795, George, Prince of Wales, age 32, the future George IV, married his first cousin Caroline of Brunswick, age 26, at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace. He did it for money. Parliament had agreed to pay off his £630,000 in personal debt only if he married a legitimate Protestant princess. Caroline was the cheapest available option. He had never met her in person. He met her 2 days before the wedding. According to the Earl of Malmesbury, who had spent weeks escorting her across Europe, George walked into the room, looked at her, walked back out, asked for a brandy, and said, quote, "Harris, I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." Malmesbury's diary also records that he had spent the journey trying to politely convince Caroline to bathe more often. She wore, in his words, coarse petticoats, coarse shifts, and thread stockings, which were never well washed or changed often enough. At the wedding itself, George was so drunk he had to be propped up by his brother, the Duke of Bedford, to keep him at the altar. He stared at his mistress, Lady Jersey, throughout the ceremony. According to Caroline's own later account to her lady-in-waiting Charlotte Barry, he then passed out in the fireplace of the bridal chamber, where she left him for the night. Quote, "He passed the greatest part of his bridal night under the grate, where he fell, and where I left him." They produced exactly one child, Princess Charlotte, born 9 months after the wedding to the day. George and Caroline then separated immediately. She moved to Italy and lived openly with an Italian courier. In 1820, Parliament tried her for adultery in a quasi-divorce proceeding called the Pains and Penalties Bill. The trial dragged on for months and was eventually abandoned. The next year, on July 19 of 1821, she tried to attend George's coronation at Westminster Abbey and was physically barred at the door. She died 3 weeks later, possibly of stomach cancer. The man who had once needed a brandy to look at her was the King of England, and she had been kept out of his coronation by guards. 11 days later they shot him from a cannon. On May 8 of 1606, in the Dormition Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin, the man known to history as False Dmitri I was crowned alongside his bride, Marina Mniszek, a Polish Catholic noblewoman of about 18. False Dmitri had spent the previous several years claiming to be the murdered youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, marching on Moscow with Polish backing, and improbably taking the Russian throne in July of 1605. Marina wore a Polish wedding gown. He wore Polish hussar armor. Patriarch Ignatius crowned her Tsaritsa, making her the first foreign-born woman and the first Catholic ever crowned in Russia. The Orthodox Russian boyars watching the ceremony noted all of this. 9 days later, at dawn on May 17 of 1606, the boyar Vasily Shusky led an uprising. The official pretext was that the Polish wedding party had been behaving in an offensive manner around the city. The real reason was that Shusky wanted the throne. False Dmitri tried to escape through a window of the Kremlin, broke his leg in the fall, was caught in a guardhouse by armed men, and shot. What happened next was, by any standard, an unusual funeral. The crowd dragged Dmitri's body to Red Square. They displayed it on a table for 3 days, with a flute jammed in its mouth as a posthumous insult. Then they took the body off the table and burned it. Then they collected the ashes. Then they packed the ashes into a cannon. Then they aimed the cannon westward, toward the Kingdom of Poland, where they claimed Dmitri had originally come from. Then they fired. This is in the contemporary Russian chronicles. It is not a folk story. Marina Mniszek survived the coup. She was confined for a while, then released when a second pretender appeared in 1607, calling himself False Dmitri II. She conveniently recognized him as her resurrected husband and joined his court. He was killed in 1610. She then attached herself to a Cossack ataman named Ivan Zarutsky and gave birth to a son in 1611. After the Romanov dynasty was established in 1613, Marina, her Cossack, and her 3-year-old son were all captured. Zarutsky was impaled. The child was publicly hanged at the Serpukhov Gate in Moscow on July 6 of 1614. Marina died in prison the same year, probably strangled. The stabbing, the explosion, and the murderer. On July 29 of 1565, Mary Queen of Scots, age 22, married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, age 19, in her private chapel at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. The day before the wedding, she had made him Duke of Albany. The day after, heralds proclaimed him King of Scots. Within months, the marriage was openly breaking down. Darnley, an inexperienced, vain, and not particularly bright teenager, demanded the crown matrimonial, which would have given him the throne for life if Mary died. When she refused, he joined a conspiracy of Protestant lords. On the evening of March 9 of 1566, Darnley and several armed accomplices burst into Mary's private supper room at Holyrood. They dragged her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, out from beside her, and stabbed him to death in the next room. The total number of wounds on Rizzio's body was 56. Mary was 6 months pregnant. One of the conspirators held a pistol against her ribs throughout. She later said Darnley had wanted her to miscarry. She had the baby anyway in June. The boy was the future James VI of Scotland and the 1st of England. The marriage was over. What happened to Darnley happened on the night of February 9 to 10th of 1567. He was sleeping at a lodging called Kirk of Field, just outside the Edinburgh walls, recovering from smallpox. Just before 2 in the morning, the entire house was blown apart by gunpowder. When the bodies of Darnley and his valet were found, they were in the garden, in their nightclothes, unmarked by the explosion. The Privy Council investigation concluded they had been strangled before the blast. The man widely suspected was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. 3 months later, Mary married Bothwell. The chronology of the courtship was, in order: Darnley was murdered in February. Bothwell was acquitted of the murder in April. Bothwell intercepted Mary on the road and brought her to Dunbar Castle and, according to her own later testimony, raped her, and on May 15 of 1567, she married him. The Scottish lords took this as confirmation of everything they had suspected. Within weeks, Mary was a prisoner. She was forced to abdicate in July, escaped to England in 1568, was held in captivity by Elizabeth I for 19 years, and was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8 of 1587. He liked her not. Henry VIII, age 48, married Anne of Cleves, age 24, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich on January 6 of 1540. He did not want to be there. The marriage had been arranged by Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, as a Protestant diplomatic alliance with the German Duchy of Cleves. The German ambassador had sent Hans Holbein the Younger, the greatest portrait painter of the century, to paint Anne in advance. Holbein's portrait, which now hangs in the Louvre, was apparently a flattering likeness. It is also probably the reason Cromwell was eventually beheaded. On New Year's Day of 1540, 5 days before the wedding, Henry rode out to Rochester to surprise Anne with a romantic court game called masking, in which a disguised king bursts into a room and tries to kiss the lady. He arrived in a disguise. He burst in. He tried to kiss her. Anne, who had been watching bullbaiting through the window and did not know the game, was repelled by the stranger and shoved him off. He left the room, changed into his royal robes, came back as the king, and was politely received. The damage was done. He reportedly muttered to Cromwell on the way out, quote, "I like her not." He married her anyway, 6 days later, because the political alliance was too important to cancel. The marriage was annulled 6 months later, on July 9 of 1540, on the official grounds of non-consummation and a prior contract on Anne's side. Henry's deposition to the Annulment Commission said he had been unable to perform because Anne smelled and her body did not please him. Quote, "I left her as good a maid as I found her." The famous line about Henry calling Anne a Flanders mare is almost certainly not real. It does not appear in any contemporary source. It was first written down by a hostile Whig bishop in 1679. The actual phrase Henry used was, simply, "I like her not." Thomas Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill 19 days after the annulment, on July 28 of 1540. The same day, Henry married Catherine Howard. Anne of Cleves accepted a generous settlement, kept her head, outlived everyone, and is the only one of the 6 wives buried in Westminster Abbey, the Bigamous Empress. Sometime in the autumn of the year 48 AD, while Emperor Claudius was at the port of Ostia inspecting a new harbor, his wife, the Empress Valeria Messalina, married another man. She was around 24. The other man was Gaius Silius, the consul designate, one of the most senior officials of the Roman state. The ceremony, as described by Tacitus in Book 11 of the Annals, was an entirely standard Roman wedding. There was a yellow veil. There were sacrifices to the gods. There was a dowry. There were signed tablets. There were witnesses. The two of them held a banquet afterward. Messalina was still legally married to the Emperor of Rome. This was bigamy committed in front of the entire city. It was also, by Roman law, treason. Tacitus does not entirely explain why Messalina did it. He suggests that she was in love with Silius, and that she persuaded herself the marriage would politically take effect because Claudius would either die conveniently or be overthrown. He also describes the wedding feast as a Bacchic revel, with Messalina dancing with her hair down and a wine staff in her hand, while Silius wore an ivy crown and stage actor's boots. By the time Claudius's freedman Narcissus rode to Ostia to give him the news, the city was already laughing. Claudius came back to Rome shaken and indecisive. The court tried to interview Messalina. She set out on foot through the city, was intercepted by guards, and taken to the gardens of Lucullus on the Pincian Hill, where she was confined while her case was being argued. Narcissus, who was a senior freedman and had every reason to fear Messalina if she lived, did not wait for Claudius to make up his mind. He sent a tribune and centurions to the gardens with orders, claiming they came directly from the emperor. Messalina was offered the option of suicide. She could not bring herself to do it. The tribune ran her through with a sword. She was about 24. Her name was then chiseled off public inscriptions all over Rome. Claudius, when told the news at dinner, reportedly said nothing, and asked for more wine. She came to us behind a coffin. On November 26 of 1894, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, age 26, married Princess Alix of Hesse, age 22, in the Grand Church of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They had been engaged since April. The wedding had originally been planned for the spring of 1895. It got moved forward by exactly 25 days because Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, had died on November 1st. Alex had converted to Russian Orthodoxy a week before the wedding and taken the Orthodox name Alexandra Fyodorovna. The wedding was held during state mourning, 3.5 weeks after the father of the groom had been buried. The peasants in Russia, who paid attention to omens, summarized the situation by saying, quote, "She came to us behind a coffin." Alexandra herself wrote that she felt joined for life. Nicholas confided to his diary that he believed everything would be fine. It was not fine. 18 months later, in May of 1896, the coronation celebrations were held in Moscow. The customary People's Feast was scheduled for May 30th at Khodynka Field, a piece of land outside the city used for army exercises and still carrying the trenches from those exercises. Each attendee was promised a souvenir, tin mug, a sausage, a piece of gingerbread, and a kerchief. Roughly 500,000 people gathered overnight to wait. At dawn, a rumor moved through the crowd that the gifts were running out. The crowd surged forward across the trench-pitted field. The official death count, recorded by the Imperial Commission, was 1,389 people crushed or trampled to death, with another 1,300 injured. That night, Nicholas and Alexandra were scheduled to attend a ball at the French ambassador's residence. Nicholas wanted to cancel. His uncles, who were running the coronation, told him that canceling would insult the French government and harm the Franco-Russian alliance. He attended, opened the ball, and left early. The next day, he and Alexandra went to the hospitals to visit the wounded and paid for the funerals from their own purse. The Bolshevik version of the story, that they danced over the bodies, is not contemporaneous. What is contemporaneous is the body count and Nicholas's diary entry that night, which reads, in part, quote, "Today a great sin occurred. Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 of their children were murdered in a basement in the city of Yekaterinburg in the early hours of July 17th of 1918. The boy who hanged the rat. On August 21st of 1745, in the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan in St. Petersburg, a 16-year-old German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, who had taken the Orthodox name Catherine Alexeyevna, married a 17-year-old German prince named Peter Fyodorovich, who would eventually become Tsar Peter III of Russia. He was the heir to the Russian throne. She had been imported by his aunt, Empress Elizabeth, to be his wife. Within hours of the ceremony, it was clear that the marriage was going to be a problem. According to Catherine's own memoirs, which she wrote later for posterity and are the central source for everything in this section, Peter informed her on the wedding night that he was actually in love with one of her maids, and then went to sleep. Over the following months and years, he turned out to be the most spectacularly bad husband in the 18th century Russian imperial record. He played with toy soldiers in the marital bed. He court-martialed them. He reviewed them and promoted them and ordered them on imaginary maneuvers. He insisted on Prussian uniforms despite the fact that Russia was, at various points, at war with Prussia. He worshipped Frederick the Great. The famous rat story is in Catherine's memoirs. She entered their apartments one day to find Peter solemnly hanging a rat by the neck from a small gallows he had set up in the corner of the room. He explained that the rat had eaten 2 of his lead toy soldiers, and that under the laws of war, this was punishable by death. The rat was left on display for 3 days as a deterrent to other rats. Catherine wrote, very politely, that she found this difficult to admire. The marriage went unconsummated for years. Catherine eventually took lovers, including Sergei Saltykov, Stanisław Poniatowski, and finally Grigory Orlov. She gave birth to a son named Paul, the future Tsar Paul I, in 1754. The paternity is debated. Empress Elizabeth died in January of 1762, and Peter ascended the throne. Within 6 months, he had given back all of Russia's gains in the 7 Years' War to Prussia, alienated the army, and announced a war on Denmark over his personal Holstein interests. On July 9th of 1762, Catherine led a coup against him, backed by Grigory Orlov and his brother Alexei. Peter was arrested, forced to abdicate, and confined at a country estate called Ropsha. 8 days later, on July 17th of 1762, Alexei Orlov killed him in custody. The official cause given was, quote, hemorrhoidal colic. The Tsarina Catherine, now empress in her own right, ruled Russia for the next 34 years. Mayerling. On May 10 of 1881, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, aged 22, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and the famous Empress Elizabeth, married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, who had just turned 17. The wedding was held at the Augustinerkirche in Vienna. Stephanie had not yet menstruated at the time of the betrothal. Her mother had to be talked into the match by Empress Elizabeth. The marriage was a slow-motion disaster on essentially every axis. Rudolf was a liberal intellectual whose politics enraged his reactionary father. He was a prolific womanizer. He drank heavily and used morphine, and he eventually infected Stephanie with gonorrhea, which left her infertile after the birth of their only daughter in 1883. By 1888, Rudolf was 30 years old, openly miserable, and conducting an affair with a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Vetsera. On January 28 of 1889, The two of them traveled to Rudolph's hunting lodge at Mayerling in the Vienna woods. In the early hours of January 30th, Rudolph shot Mary Vetsera in the head. He then sat with her body for several hours. Then he shot himself. His valet found them both at around 8 in the morning. The Austro-Hungarian court did not handle the news well. The first official bulletin out of Vienna said heart attack. The second admitted the prince had killed himself but did not mention Mary Vetsera at all. Her body was smuggled out of Mayerling, dressed, propped between her two uncles in a carriage, as if she were still alive, and quietly buried at Heiligenkreuz Abbey at night. Her farewell letters were rediscovered in a Vienna bank vault in 2015 and confirmed that she had gone to Mayerling knowing she would die. One of them ends, quote, "I am happier in death than life." The political consequences were enormous. With Rudolph dead and Stephanie childless, the Austro-Hungarian succession passed to Franz Joseph's brother, then to that brother's son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28 of 1914. The First World War followed within 5 weeks. The collapse of the Habsburg Empire followed within 4 years. 2 emperors and a continent went down because the wrong people had been married off to each other at the Augustinerkirche in 1881. Stephanie outlived everyone. She remarried in 1900 against her family's wishes, was disinherited by her own father, lived in Hungary, wrote a memoir, and died in August of 1945 at the age of 81, days after Soviet troops looted her castle. The Empress who never got to be Empress lived through 2 world wars and the disappearance of every court that had ever invited her to a wedding.